Welcome to the Vernacular. It's the second podcast of the Vernacular. I'm Vernon Harrison.
And I'm Dori Spade.
And we're here hoping you get something out of spending your time with us today. This is only our second episode of the Vernacular together. And so today we've decided to have a very broad general conversation about the state of the MSP industry, which, by the way, we can take this anywhere, Dori.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of information out there, and I come from a place of what's going to help make a positive impact on our listeners. So let's get into it.
All right. So I do want to start with a couple of interesting industry statistics that I recently discovered. Now, I don't know how many MSPs there are in the United States, and maybe our producer will go research that and let us know. But I did learn that the market size in 2024 was $197.3 billion. That's for outsourced IT services. A lot of that is outsourced individuals. But I want you to hold that thought. If you're listening to this or watching on the podcast, it's $197 billion. Now take a look at your gross revenue. That's right. None of us are getting enough that are listening to this, and we're going to fix that. However, I thought what was pretty amazing, Dori, is it is projected to be by the end of this decade over $300 billion. That means we are going to grow by another $100 billion by the end of the decade. And I'm going to go out and claim that if you listen to the vernacular, you'll be the one that gets the 100 billion. How do you feel about that, Dori?
I think that's great. Those are amazing statistics. And now we need to figure out how that can trickle down to the growth of each person listening to us today.
All right. So my producer sent me a note, says there are approximately 40,000. I actually disagree with that because, I've heard anywhere from 50,000 to 100,000. And so if we talk about how many MSPs out there, I like to include the guy who doesn't have a W-2 job. He's a break fix guy. He's got a bunch of accounts. He is a managed service or break fix provider. I think that's a very large percentage of the industry. And sometimes for some of us and those MSPs that have multiple employees, they're very frustrated when, from a competitive standpoint, because typically those guys are working out of the house. But I think the number's much, much higher than that. What do you think, Dori? Do you have a thought on that or?
I think I'm not sure what the producer was looking at. I have heard that number, but in the U.S. alone. So,
Okay.
I think that certainly globally the number is way bigger.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
I have heard that number thrown out there as well.
Okay. So then let's trust the numbers. Google doesn't lie. Just unless it's doing my taxes, then it has to. No. All right. So there's approximately 40,000 of you out there, one form or another. And again, I'm sure some of those are the onesie twosie employees. And so I think the industry today, if we take a quick look at the history, back in the 90s, early 2000, many of us were VARs. We were reselling products, and sometimes we were doing implementation services and things like that. And when it became clear that that was not going to be profitable enough, and there are still many, many resellers out there and value-added resellers who still exist, we migrated to a more service-oriented model. As the products, right, as products went to things like software as a service and no longer installing things like Exchange, right, and applications are a service, I think we've truly embedded into the managed service offering. Because we're not, you're not installing those things in your small business anymore. You're leveraging them, and you need somebody with IT know-how to first and foremost guide that ship, right, in those decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. And the industry, I think, continues to become more and more complex as technology becomes more and more complex. Things have become very specialized. And so the days of, a simple working out of the trunk of your car are long gone. And now we're looking at some different needs for all the MSPs, even the ones that are new and the ones that have been around for a long time.
And that's a great point because it's reflective too of their clients. I mean, you think about it today, a guy could, you know, 20 years ago or even 10 years ago might have started a local landscaping service, but today he's got to have a website, right? There's a very
Mm.
good chance that his invoice and billing is, computerized. I mean, it's crazy if it's not, right? And so from the other side, companies, all of our clients, and we're a B2B sell, are embracing technology in some form or fashion. In fact, even being able to be paid, electronically, right, is part of often your bookkeeping system. So you're right. The complexities have changed on both sides of the street, which I think is good news, by the way, because if the complexity is not there, our value add disappears or dissipates. So
Yes, that's true.
I think one of the biggest challenges, well, I hear, and we're more, let's on the growth and sales and management and leadership side of the house. And so there are technical issues, and we're not going to drill down into technical issues or PSA issues, but I think one of the issues sometimes is finding the right IT staff and maintaining employees. In fact, Dori and I intend to do an episode just on best practices for keeping good people. And I'm sure that we can use a whole episode on that. But going back again, talking about the industry, we're talking about the challenges that may be related to growth or sustainability or even competitive concerns. And when I say competitive concerns, I mean for all MSPs. You know, Vendors like MSP or Amazon doing something that is very difficult for you to compete with. AI, becoming an obstacle for, as well as a tool for you, but also an obstacle for you because people feel there's less of a need for something they maybe could get done through AI.
Yes, and just looking at, we're talking about some of the challenges in the industry, but I'm really eager to talk about the opportunity for the industry. And what I'm seeing in different studies and surveys that have been done is high functioning MSPs are projecting upwards of 25% growth in 2025. So that's the fun story, right? That's where we really want to help our audience be in that category.
Yeah, economies are cyclical too, and I would encourage all of you, too, from a pricing standpoint. Um, this is actually, in my opinion, a pretty good time to get the price that you deserve. The cost of everything has gone up. And as a matter of fact, for one of my clients who hadn't done a rate increase in 4 years, the compounded inflation rate in the last 4 years compounded was 25%. So,
Wow.
and they were, yeah, and they were struggling with the idea of a 5 to 10% increase, which by the way might be fair. This doesn't mean you should raise your rates 25%, but that's the compounded interest rate. And
Hmm.
and so your costs have gone up too, as well as your employees. Hopefully, when you do the rate increases too, that you share some of that. Your employees are struggling because everything that that they're involved in has gone up. So increasing revenues through price increases is something that you should consider. And I also would suggest to you that if you want to reach out to Dori or I personally to have that kind of conversation around your market and your company, because there's no way we could generally address that, please feel free to do so. Um, you know, our opinion is always worth what you pay for it when it's free. I think that's great. That's a good glasses half full kind of point to make. Um, and so when we talk about growth too, I think it's gotten highly competitive between MSPs. How do you feel about that, Dory?
I agree, and the surveys are saying the same thing. I may have mentioned this previously on our podcast, Vern, but um, today people are looking at about 60+% of customers are getting competitive quotes when their MSP contract is ready to roll over. So as compared to a couple of years ago when the average was 20% getting competitive quotes. So MSPs are nervous about losing customers. And when you look at the lifetime value of a customer, you can understand why. And so I think, what can they do to make sure that that client does not go with a competitor and that their proposal is differentiated, not just on price. So that's some of the things I'm seeing in the industry as well.
So there's two sides to that coin though, too, right? Because legacy accounts typically aren't paying enough, right? So we could kind of maybe the positive spin, since you put the positive spin on the last one, maybe the positive spin on that is you win some and you lose some. And everything you win is going to pay more. To your point, you never want to lose on price. But the industry, all boats rise in the tide. What's that expression, right? All ships rise with the
Rise
tide.
in the tide, yeah.
Yeah, all ships rise with the tide. So based on what you're saying too, I think one that it's good that people are going out and getting quotes, because if you don't lose them, there's going to be a better recognition of your value. Okay, so I would never discourage a client from getting another quote. It's typically the incumbents to lose. And if you're on that thin a thread, come on, man, you got to do better, right? You got to maybe with more account management and thoroughness. But sometimes people just don't see the value and let them go torture another MSP, right?
Yeah.
But right, so I think there's some good in it being competitive, and I think part of it too can be some stabilization on getting a good price, because the number one issue, I think, for even the folks that are soliciting the quotes is the fact that the end user really doesn't understand what they're buying. And it is hard to articulate the value of what you're offering by talking about what cybersecurity tools you use. I mean, that's like your mechanic telling you uses a specific torque wrench. What do you know, right? On what? What's a torque wrench? What bolt? What bolt needs to be
Right,
torqued, right? You know what I mean?
right.
So
And what's it going to do for me?
so maybe through this era of investigation and competitive quoting, we can get a more intelligent and informed buyer audience. So with that in mind, let's maybe we'll talk a little bit about the end users a bit, and then we'll kind of come back around as to what kind of MSP can service those. Look, there's still a lot of small companies out there that are going to live in the break fix world, and I know some MSPs who do not do break fix. They just won't do it, and I don't disagree with them. I don't disagree with them. However, I've always found and I always recommend that it's easier to transact more with a client that's been transacting with you in the first place. So sometimes doing that break fix can be a fertile ground for companies that grow, right? I mean, just because I fix your computer today doesn't mean I need to do it tomorrow. So why not answer a few of those calls and get to know those clients? Excuse me, to better understand maybe some of their needs. What's your thought on the break fix environment, Dori?
I think that the general school of thought is it's not necessarily the best way to go, but I do totally agree with you that getting your foot in the door and being able to demonstrate your value is a very, good strategy. The one thing that MSPs need to be concerned about, if we unpack it a little bit further, is that there's a lot of there can be some liability on the break fix model because you're just jumping into a situation that you don't really have necessarily a holistic view and picture of. So I think it has to be used wisely. I think that people need to look at what could be the upside of the relationship and is it worth investing in. And I would say that the same thing with working with startups, for example. I've had great success in my career as an MSP excuse me, with startups. where some people may not have even wanted to touch a 3 or 4 or 5 person firm, but I had a lot of them that grew to 30, 40, 50 person firms where, our MRR was $8,000, $9,000 a month. And they stuck with me. I knew the company. I knew, our company knew their company. So there's always looking at that upside potential, I think is where we need to focus.
Great thoughts. To surmise, let's start with the caution, right? There's a certain degree of caution and danger, if you will.
Yeah.
There's also, I will call it the frustration factor. They're typically the most difficult clients to deal with or understand to get paid. But there is the discovery, to your point. I bet you had some great feelings about some of those startups, about where they could go.
Absolutely.
And I think it's probably fair to say that in those roles, you were part of that growth because you were helping them leverage technology. So even though they're small, we both agree that the best thing that any MSP has to offer is their technology leadership. All right, so break fix, I can't begrudge you for not doing it, but I do think it's an opportunity that should be approached with caution. All right. So sort of the next level, though, the next product would, of course, be managed services. And, I often think of MSPs by revenue size or by or by vertical. And so if you're to go from 1 million to $2 million isn't first you want to get to that $1 million, right? That seven-figure MSP, right? From 1 million to 2 isn't bad. I think going from 2 to 5 can be a difficult journey. I think once you hit 5 is where you really need to think about organic growth and having a sales organization. I think under $2 million, you want to focus on branding and a quality website. And of course, from 5, the journey, by the way, from 5 to 10 is interesting and is fraught with new challenges, as it is from 10 to 20. But let's face it, at 20, you have just far more opportunities to grow because you have investable funds and things like that, and probably a pretty good reputation.
Yeah. So Vernon, let's talk about the $2 to $5 million
Okay.
area. What do you bring? What can you help an MSP with the 2 to 5 million, like getting from 2 to 5 million? Are there certain standard areas that you really like to drill in with those clients?
Great question, Dori. And it wasn't a plug, by the way, but it's a great question. And, there is a reason why Dori and I know each other, and that's because we help MSPs. So it's be interesting to see what I would bring to the table. Now, I want you to answer your own question after I do too, Dori, okay? Out of fairness.
Sure.
And and if it's some of the same things, please just, go ahead and say that. But I think one of the things that I really like to bring to the table on the 2 to 5s is really understanding leadership and business, because everything begins and ends with leadership. I've become a member of the John Maxwell leadership team. And, when I graduated from college in engineering, and I started my first MSP. It was very break fix, and I grew because I was really good at fixing stuff. Sound familiar, most MSPs, right? Your business grows because you're good at taking care of computers, okay? But when you start to get to that 2 to 3, the 3 to 5 range or over that 2 range, you got to take a look at business structure and the challenges that come with it. At some point you might be required to have workman's compensation insurance and things like that. And then you've got to think about an organizational structure. Who needs to think about an organizational structure when you have 5 employees, right? Because everybody's got to do a little of everything. So I think the most important thing that I first like to bring is that understanding of duties and responsibilities. As a matter of fact, one of the books I recommend at that phase is Traction, and to just kind of get the understanding of some of those things. Obviously, there's a lot to bring there too. And then I would say the second part of that, outside of leadership and business acumen, would be to understand a sales and marketing strategy. And they're as individual as you are. By the way, for under 2 million, just make sure you get a good website. In fact, Dori, you said it earlier about, trying to, differentiate yourself or your value. It's a big challenge, but we are all MSPs. Okay. Just like all restaurants are restaurants, there are differences and it's in our menu, but how do you articulate that to the audience? In the restaurant business, you can show pictures of your food. And to a degree, maybe you can do that here too. But for the under 2 million, I would say stay in that lane with a good website and think about branding. For the 2 to 5 million, again, leadership, business acumen, and developing a sales and marketing strategy. All right. Now, by the way, if your answer is completely the same or you want to emphasize a certain part about what you bring to the table, Dori, for the sake of our listening audience, so they would know us good, it doesn't matter if we're repeating, on the
Yeah.
podcast. Okay.
Yeah. No, I mean, I love your approach, Vernon. Of course, leadership is really super important. And as you mentioned, a lot of the leaders in MSPs came from a technical background. They need to learn more the business side, the business acumen side. That's very, very important. So I agree 100% on that. And that's certainly an area that I help MSPs with as well. One thing that I see common in the 2 to 5 or trying to get from 2 to 5 is this consolidation of roles and responsibilities that now needs to be broken apart. So looking at, what the roles and responsibilities are more individualized, more separate lanes than 4 people, 5 people, 8 people, whatever it is, in your $2 million MSP, all wearing multiple hats. And so, how do you break that apart? This is one of the exercises that I've helped a lot of MSPs with. It's very, very important because each MSP has their own strengths and areas of opportunity for improvement. So, for example, if it's a super technical person, I wouldn't necessarily want that person to wear the sales hat. I might encourage that person to hire a salesperson. If they have a sales background, then that's a little bit of a different story. Maybe they get to a point where they hire a client success manager instead of owner doing all, the business reviews or whatever. So really breaking apart those roles is one of the key areas that I think is super important to get from 2 to 5 million.
That's a great point because, as I heard you say, breaking apart the roles, and we've both been there. Sometimes we've got to get owners to let go of something, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
so if you're listening today and you're the owner, you're the CEO, you have to ask yourself, do I need to do this or can I have someone else to do it? And I think the key word there is do I need to? You can't ask who's going to do this best because come on, this business is built around you and what you bring to the table. And so sometimes you've got to, maybe I know it's tough, especially if you're OCD, right? But sometimes you're going to miss a dot on an I or a cross on a T. And you got to allow that to happen so that people can grow in those positions. So breaking that out, and I think, unless you've got another suggestion, I think one of my favorite things to do is say, "Do I need to do that? Do I need to do that?" If I was an owner, right, and you were saying to me, if I said to you, "Okay, Dori, what can I give up?" Do you have some suggestions there outside of my generalization one? Like, what is the most common thing you might see that you ask someone to let go? You mentioned sales, but
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I start with asking, what's your superpower? And once
ooh,
you tell me what your superpower is and what things you don't really enjoy doing or feel like you're very good at doing, that's where I start on recommending that we hire and break apart the role.
or
So,
delegate. Half the time, there's
yes,
somebody there willing to do it.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. So, that's really where I start is the person's superpower is. And I do the same with my company, with my consulting company, Vernon. I When I started my company, I looked at, hey, what is it that I'm really terrible at? And I knew marketing was one of them. So I'm like, I'm not the marketer. I have to hire out marketing. I do have a sales background, so I can play in that, area, in that lane. And I do have a service leadership background, so I can play in that lane. But in the technical, I still fight my way through it.
Well, then,
But I may
no,
hire that out soon.
You got to delegate it, Dori. You got to come on.
Absolutely.
We got to practice what we preach. So,
exactly.
Just a quick side story. When I got my first personal assistant 8 years ago, the guy who I was working for said, "What are you doing setting up your own appointments?" I said, "What do you mean? What am I doing? Who doesn't set up their own appointments?" He said, "I got you a personal assistant. If you ask me today if you can meet with me, I'll tell you, well, let's check with Chris."
I
Because
know. I
right?
got put in that bucket before.
Oh, there you go. But you know what you get, Dori? If you want to meet with me, you get me to show up because it becomes Chris's responsibility. He finds the gap in my schedule, and I don't drive him crazy by triple double booking. He also knows the flow. And so this is a great example of something so simple that I delegated that I never worry about.
Right.
I forward emails to him. It's certainly much broader than that and more important than that. But I love this idea of, by the way, holding on. And I may even go one step further, say, even if your superpower is such and such, like you're really good at dividing up the tickets. Dude, that's a skill you can train somebody else to do because you are the man, you are the woman, you are the king, right? So,
Right.
so leverage that. And I hope for this episode, which we never know where these are going to go, by the way. I want you all to know that Dori and I don't get together. We pick a subject because we want this to be spontaneous. We started this by talking about the industry and where it is. And I think we've covered that a little bit. But, I think you hit a great point, Dori, in emphasizing on the 2 to 5 today, because there's so many of you. And by the way, if you're not quite to 2 yet, you're going to get there. And so and if you think of these challenges, you'll escalate your growth. You'll meet the obstacles, or as we often like to say in sales, meet the objections before they happen. Take a look at your team. Again, what can you delegate? Trust but verify, checks and balances. And again, if you're over $1 million, read Traction. I think I've sold more of their books than I've sold of my own, but I think Traction is a good read. And since I started with leadership, I would tell you too, John Maxwell's 5 Levels of Leadership is a must read for any person in any industry who has anyone who reports to them. John Maxwell is a world-renowned expert on leadership in general. I think he's made me a better father and husband too.
Wow, that's great.
Any other closing thoughts, Dori?
No, just that I'm excited to continue the conversation, and maybe we'll look at bands of revenue for MSPs and what common challenges there are with those bands of revenue, or let's hear from our listeners on what they'd like us to address.
Well, at this early stage, with only our spouses and our children's listening to our podcast, I think we ought to take the challenge of putting those segments into the vernacular and create them ourselves and maybe get adjusted, right? I mean, I think we did a little bit today, going 1 to 2, 2 to 5, 3 to 5. It was great. I appreciate, Dori, I appreciate you taking this journey with me. For those of you who are listening, I would like to say, go to work. But remember, don't forget when you go home to kiss your family. Anything to add, Dori?
That's all for me as well, Vernon. Have a great week, everyone.
Thank you for joining us.